Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for coming. We are at 11:05, so let's start and we can have a nice intimate discussion amongst the folks that are here. It gives me very great pleasure to introduce, well, maybe I should introduce myself first. I'm Alex Len-Ferner here, a postdoc at Nelson Mandela University, and in case you're unaware of where you are in the digital world, this is the Iscia seminar on everything is energy. And today, I'm very excited to have Tara Nair van Ryneveld, who is the Climate Policy Coordinator at the South African Faith Communities Environmental Institute. And she's going to give us a talk on the history of energy and colonialism. And so just to say a little bit more about who Tara is. So as I said, Climate Policy Coordinator at SAFCEI, and it's within the Rural Action for Climate Resilience project. She completed her master's in environmental studies and sustainability science at Lund University, where her research focused on coloniality as a barrier to climate action in the South African context. She is passionate about bridging conversations on decoloniality and sustainability to enable radical climate action. If I might use my facilitator's hat to also plug one of Tara's papers that I'll share in the chat, which is Coloniality as a Barrier to Climate Action, a very, very good paper that I thoroughly enjoyed, which kind of really made me want to invite Tara to the seminar. So thank you, Tara, for joining us, and I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Alex. I am going to start sharing my screen, but just give me a heads up if you can see it, and hopefully not see my notes at the same time.
We can see your notes. I did this once before. I shared all my notes with everybody, so you might have to share a different screen.
Let's see. No, wait. Can you see this now?
That's looking good. Thank you.
And hold on, I need to just change. This worked earlier, but I think we tested it out when I joined, and now it seems to have.
No worries. Let's see if it'll work.
Can you still see my notes?
Nope, just the slides. So we're looking good.
Okay. Okay, so I was asked to give this talk on the history of energy and colonialism, and it's a pretty broad topic, so I won't be covering every possible angle. I think they're pretty obvious ways that the geographies of access to energy, the extraction of energy through fossil fuels, and the production of energy has been shaped by colonial history, both in South Africa and in other parts of the world. You can ask the question of who has access to energy and what does it provide. If we have access to energy through electricity, fuel, transport, we externalize the labor that is required for certain activities, which means that we have more human energy to do other things. And some of you might have read Matt Huber's book, Lifeblood, which this is kind of the premise of his book, that underpinning the American dream is the American way of life is oil. And in South Africa, I think we're quite similar in terms of our heavy reliance on coal to provide electricity, to produce liquid fuel locally. And many of our mainstream popular conceptions of success, of progress, of modernity, of a good life are underpinned by this requirement for energy. But the kind of entry point that I take, because of my background that I did my master's research in, is coal and coloniality. And when we think about coal, it was one of the foundational fuels for the Industrial Revolution, and by extension also fuel for colonization and the extraction of resources. And so today's presentation is going to be less about the history of colonialism, more about the legacy of colonialism in the way that we think through a concept called coloniality, which I'll explain a bit more later on in this presentation. And it obviously links to energy because of our reliance on coal providing energy in South Africa. So before I get into the depths of this presentation, I just wanted to sort of pose a question for you to sit with during the course of this presentation. And that is, what people's, cultures, modes of thinking, ways of being and doing do we sacrifice in pursuit of energy-intensive success, progress, modernity, and the promise of a good life? And as Alex mentioned, this presentation is drawing largely on the research that I did for my master's, which came out in this paper. So the rest of the presentation is going to be following closely the structure of the paper. So to start off with, I think it's important that we think about how we tell the story of climate change. And you might ask why this is significant. Well, because the way that we tell the story of climate change shapes how we respond to this crisis that we're in. And the way that we talk about things also can create barriers to how we can cognitively think about that response. So there was this paper by Lam et al. Where they talk about how discourse can create barriers to acting on climate change. And essentially what the idea is that basically propaganda has a force, right? This is the kind of common sort of narrative that discourse has the ability to shape the way that it's not just about what we're saying, it also has the ability to shape our actions. And they provide a number of different sort of examples of how discourse can create barriers to climate action and delay climate action, such as through strategies that rely on a sense of individualism and the importance of individual climate action, or they might greenwash fossil fuels and say, oh, we can use natural gas. They might, you might have nations that are pointing to other nations that have that are more emission intensive than they are. Anyway, so they have these different examples of discourse that creates barriers to climate action. And I think in the bottom right corner, we can't afford to act on climate. I think this is one of the big sort of themes of climate action delay in a South African context, where the appeal to the costs, where they appeal to the costs on the economy and sort of the social justice implications of acting on climate change. So just to, I mean, many of you in this room, I wasn't sure what the audience would be like. So this is not going to be news to you, I think. But just to sort of give a little bit of a context on the South African case of climate inaction, where I never know whether we're the 12th or the 13th or 15th, but somewhere around there, it seems to change, where I'm going to go with 13th highest greenhouse gas emitter. And we're responsible for half of the emissions from the African. And this is predominantly because of our electricity sector. So 88% of our electricity comes from coal, which is higher even than the percentage of electricity based on coal in India, for example. And it's also the highest emissions relative to GDP amongst BRICS nations. And yet, we're also a highly unequal country, right? The wealth of the average Black household is equivalent to 4% of the average white household. 64% of Black Africans are classified as poor, in contrast to 1% of the white population. And what this implies is that our emission-intensive development hasn't really addressed inequality in our country. We're also one of the highest single point of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. And this is commonly when people talk about the issue of climate change from a South African perspective, we focus on the apartheid period and the establishment of SAFCEI. And SAFCEI is this single highest point of greenhouse gas emissions. And the reason that SAFCEI was established was a fear of sanctions, energy sanctions during the apartheid period, which was then leading SAFCEI to adopt this incredibly emission-intensive process of converting coal into liquid fuel. It's a relic from the past that isn't used anywhere else in the world, and we have that in South Africa. And then, of course, Eskom as well was the other sort of big energy facility that people also often tie to the apartheid period. And so then when we start talking about acting on climate change, I think people often will conceptualize the sort of start of the climate change story in a South African context with a focus on apartheid. And yet we have a very strong colonial history to our carbon emissions. So coal mining began in the mid-1800s. It rapidly expanded in the late 1800s in response to demand for gold and diamond extraction. In fact, interestingly, the gold industry's Chamber of Mines mediated the coal industry's access to black migrant labor through the Witwatersrand Native Labor Association. And many of you will know of head and hut taxes, which drove many young Black men to work in the mines and created this cheap Black migrant labor. And so essentially what I'm trying to draw a link here is that coal mining enabled the colonial exploitation of South Africa's other mineral resources, which in turn then led to the encouragement of the coal industry expanding and the coal value chain expanding. And then you have these extractive industries being triggering an expansion of infrastructure both within and between mining-centered settlements, which we can see it has resulted in this long-held association between mineral extraction, wealth accumulation, and development, as well as laying down many of the spatial foundations for apartheid's extraction of Black labor. So when we start thinking about climate change and climate action from a South African perspective, we cannot disregard this history, the fact that our emissions are predominantly from a coal-based energy system, which has this deeply entrenched colonial history. And essentially our fossil fuel dependent development path was established during the colonial period. The foundations were laid in that period. So at this point, I want to sort of change gear a little bit, and it'll make sense, to introduce this concept of coloniality, which is the hierarchies of power that remain after the end of the colonial administration, right? And there are different ways that one can think of coloniality, but another sort of mechanism is that it is a way of thinking about, of constructing, and of perpetuating capitalist modernity. And the idea is that it essentially continues the project of colonization, but at a cognitive level, in the way that we are thinking about the world, and the way that we are engaging with the world. And so what we have when bringing it back to South Africa is you can see apartheid was an extreme manifestation and extension of coloniality, of the way that different power dynamics were being represented very tangibly in social relations and development. And also what the democratic government then in 1994 inherited was an already emission intensive state that was based around the industrialization, based on an industrialization around mineral extraction and energy production. And I think a classic example of this is the inheritance of, or the sort of adaptation of the apartheid state's redistributive policy, which was used to transfer wealth within mining from British to Afrikaner populations. And the democratic government adapted this into the Black Economic Empowerment Program, which today is highly prevalent in the coal mining value chain. And it, there are many conversations around how it has been critiqued in terms of how it relies on a trickle-down form of economic empowerment, and has really contributed to creating a new elite that has been tied to the former white centers of mining capital. And the poster child of the BEE program is Exxaro, which is also one of the largest providers of coal to Eskom, the state-owned energy facility. And despite the poor performance of BEE in terms of achieving widespread wealth equity, and despite the fact that our coal deposits are dwindling and that they're poor in quality and not considered very favorable for exports, despite the high levels of environmental and health hazards associated with the coal value chain, there is this deep-seated belief in a mineral-centered development and sector as a sunrise economy with unexplored potential. And so we're in this situation where, given that there is this BEE program that subscribes to this old and entrenched colonial belief of mineral extraction as the source of wealth, there is a very strong opposing political interest in tackling climate change in the context of tackling our emissions. And so this is spun by politicians like Gwede Matash into a narrative that tackling climate change is in opposition with achieving racial equity. And I think this is an important sort of idea to keep at the back of your mind as we go forward into the rest of this presentation. But essentially what I wanted to think about was, what is coloniality's contribution to climate delay discourses in South Africa? So I asked three broad questions. What are the identified barriers to climate action in South Africa? How are these barriers created and perpetuated in the discourse through colonial hierarchies? And what are the alternatives formulated in resistance to the dominant discourses on climate action? And I combined this theory of colonial hierarchies of power with a critical discourse analysis, which I think is a useful combination, because they're both interested in concepts of dominance, in concepts of power. And I was left, so I went through, I didn't tell you. So I was interviewing a number of people. I conducted 18 interviews with government officials, with consultants, with academics, activists, and members from various civil society organizations. And then I also looked at policy documents. So the National Development Plan, the National Climate Change Response White Paper, and then the COVID Reconstruction and Recovery Plan. And these, outline the official national response to both development and climate change. And sort of through an iterative process, there were three hierarchies of power that became more and more relevant to my analysis of this material. And these were hierarchies in a global economy, hierarchies of race and class, and hierarchies of epistemology. And I made a point to focus on African scholars who do research on colonization, unpack each of these hierarchies, because, just to make the point that their decoloniality and theory on decolonization is often associated with South American or like the post-colonial school. So this was sort of the thought process was to highlight that there are actually a really large number of African scholars who have worked on these topics. So when we think about hierarchies in a global economy, the climate action barrier that emerged and that I kind of touched on earlier is that climate action threatens growth. And the dominant discourse puts forward that South Africa basically cannot act on climate change because it needs to remain competitive internationally. And here we have from the National Development Plan that South Africa needs to remain competitive throughout the transition to a low carbon future, and that it needs to balance climate change concerns with employing least cost power generation technologies to propel economic growth. And I think there's further evidence of this in the level of involvement of the National Business Institute in the drafting of the Just Energy Transition Partnerships investment plan. I mean, even the title of an investment plan, right? It's not, the focus is on investment, not on justice. Another interesting point that came up in the interviews is that, you know, there are bigger international mining companies like Anglo-American that are selling their sort of dirty South African assets to smaller, less capital-rich but Black-owned mining companies that are potentially sort of posing more of an environmental risk because they don't have as much of a requirement to publicly disclose their environmental performance on an international platform. So then the second climate action barrier that emerged from the research was that of poverty and inequality. So the idea was that poverty and inequality are more urgent issues to address than climate change. And that the dominant discourse puts forward that the best way to address the needs of the poor Black South Africans in particular is through emission-intensive development and the jobs that are associated with this. And so we have one of the interviewees that I spoke to saying, in a country with 35% unemployment and potentially some real structural economic challenges coming out of COVID, yeah, South Africa definitely needs mining. And so what we see here is the dominant discourse perpetuating this capitalist colonial modernity and dismissing the possibility of alternative development paths or the pluriverse of options when we think about how we could go about creating a good life for all. And then finally, the last climate action barrier that emerged was that climate action is complex and technical, and this emerged when thinking about the hierarchies of epistemologies. And because climate change is considered to be complex and technical, the dominant discourse puts forward that acting on climate change, climate action must also be complex and technical, requiring a certain kind of knowledge, and that the climate action needed is large scale. So, for example, a government interviewee from the Department of Environmental Affairs says, it's complex, it's jargon, climate change itself is just another language. And another interviewee that I spoke to said, climate change is an issue of the global commons, not of the local commons. It's not about grazing land in the Transkei. And I think this is interesting to think about because it kind of is about grazing land in the Transkei, because our local commons are connected to global commons. And this rationalization of their disconnection is precisely something that emerges from a kind of scientific rationality steeped in coloniality that seems at odds with diverse epistemologies. And it places the climate crisis as something that is kind of post-political. It doesn't need to engage with the deeply embedded contradiction that assumes that the mindset and the rationality and the sort of systems of production that produced the climate crisis in the first place, we're assuming that same mindset and that same forms of rationality has the capability of solving the climate crisis. And it conveniently glosses over the fact that the climate crisis, like the cost of living crisis, is a symptom of something that is fundamentally flawed in the system that we're existing in, and that there is a need to open doors to step out of the system if we are to truly address these issues at their source. So now I'm going to be talking about the alternative discourses that emerged. So when we were talking about climate action as a threat to growth, the interviewees who kind of got lumped into the alternative discourses, many of them put forward this idea that South Africa was established as a subordinate extractive economy. So global resource needs will always be prioritized. And I think this is kind of, we see this in the example that I mentioned earlier about, you know, Anglo selling their dirty assets to local South African companies, so that the production, the markets of having these coal producing mines still exists. The international companies don't need to be sort of tied to it and dirty their names. And one of the interviewees put forward, specifically talking about climate justice and the just transition. They said, this debate about climate justice and the just transition is dominated by elite thinking, which is often concerned with small changes within the existing order, and the climate crisis demands something much more revolutionary. So it's not just about replacing, you know, our highly energy intensive, emissions intensive system with renewable energy. We have to be thinking a bit deeper than that. And then the second climate action barrier that was sort of dominating, that emerged from the discourse, was that poverty and inequality are more urgent issues to address. And the alternative discourse puts forward that poverty and racial inequality are linked to the environment. So ignoring this just maintains the status quo, and this development benefits the few at the cost of the many. And I think when we think about the violent inaction and political abandonment of miners and mining affected communities who are continuously subjected to hazardous conditions for the greater good of a nation shaped around extraction, I think there are so many examples of this. So one community activist, for example, highlighted how the assassination of anti-mining activists in current day South Africa echoes the assassination of their ancestors who fought against their land being taken by the apartheid government. So, for example, the assassination of Sikwasiphi Radebe in 2016, of Fikile Ntshangase in 2020. Another example of kind of violent inaction and political abandonment is the Marikana massacre. So essentially, the mining sector in South Africa has a history of perpetuating the death of poor Black communities, whether through structural or direct violence. And, you know, mining companies in current day South Africa are often still involved in negotiating communities' dispossession of land and cultural heritage, often through traditional leaders who are not always representative of wider community interests. And one of the community activists that I interviewed highlighted that there is a bit of a myth when it comes to mining necessarily providing jobs and improving local livelihoods, because often mining companies are looking for skilled workers, and many of the rural communities in these areas are either not skilled or not skilled in the skills that the mining companies are looking for. And then as a result of the mining, you have a destruction of livelihoods, because now, as this quote puts forward, there is nothing coming out from the trees. The fruit and their livestock were dying slowly. When it comes to development, people have no right to choose. So this further emphasizes how mining causes poverty through threatening people's livelihoods and not really providing local jobs. But despite people's resistance at a local level to these extractive industries coming in, there's a sense that people don't have the right to choose. And finally, the final climate action barrier that I was talking about was this idea that climate change is complex and technical, and you know, that there is this hierarchy of different ways of engaging with climate change and different ways of thinking. And so what the alternative discourse puts forward is that contrary to climate change being complex and technical and requiring a certain kind of knowledge to act on it, we actually need local action. And we need a kind of climate action that is simple and that centers people's lives, and that this is already emerging. But often alternative ways of engaging or living are not recognized as forms of climate action. And I think, I mean, in this context, the work of, for example, the Climate Justice Coalition, the South African Food Sovereignty Movement, the Climate Justice Charter Movement, I think these conversations are alive in these spaces. They're not as widespread when we start talking about climate change as an issue in South Africa. And I think this is where there is a lot of potential to be talking about the cost of living crisis, the energy crisis, and building greater food sovereignty in general. So in summary, there were 3 barriers to climate action identified in the discourse through using colonial hierarchies, the hierarchies in the global economy, hierarchies of race and class, and hierarchies of epistemology. And the implication is that coloniality contributes to delaying climate action. And coming back to the connection between coloniality and coal, or coloniality and energy, the foundations of fossil fuel dependence were laid by colonization, and coloniality upholds this dependence. And so what this calls to us is, requires of us, is that we within the local and global climate space really need to engage with decolonial discussions and mobilizations. Using coloniality as a lens requires us to recognize the interconnectedness between struggles and resistances. And it also draws attention to the need to reflect on the ways that modernity suppresses some ways of thinking and normalizes others, which in turn influences the way that we act and respond to climate change. Often because this suppression happens at a sort of cognitive level, in the way that we think, is less tangible than material struggles of class or gender, for example. But ultimately, what it's pointing towards is that we can no longer assume that Euro-American knowledge, or a sort of colonial knowledge with a deep colonial history, or a colonial way of thinking and a colonial rationality, we can no longer assume that these modes of thinking can solve the issues that are inherent in colonial modernity, like the climate crisis. And so to wrap up, something to sit with, this was the something to sit with that I put forward at the beginning of the presentation. What peoples, cultures, modes of thinking, ways of being do we sacrifice in pursuit of success, progress, modernity, and the promise of a good life? And I'm going to leave you with 2 quotes from my interviewees. The first one is, the importance is for people to understand the link between their daily lived experience, and especially their experience of women having to work harder to grow food on degraded land, walk longer distances to get access to water that's being polluted by coal mines, and to care for people who are ill from coal mining. And finally, from one of the community activists that I interviewed, we are not against modernity, we are for modernity, but not to change the way that we live. Those are the main things that, before they put the development on top of our heads, they need to say that it's not going to destroy our values, our respect, and our culture. Yeah, so that's the end of my slideshow. I'm gonna stop sharing and hand back to Alex.
Thank you very much, Tara. It was a really insightful talk. We started 5 minutes late, so we have about 25 minutes for questions on our schedule. So if anybody has any questions that they would like to ask Tara, please feel free to raise your hand and chime in. I see Gary's already on stack, so Gary, over to you. And let's try keep these questions as questions. I know in the past some folks have kind of gone on very long comments. So we'll try to keep these brief so we can get a few questions in. Thanks, folks.
All right, thank you for an excellent insight, and thanks, Alex. Just a very quick question to you. I mean, and very topical, is that Minister Mantashe has been using a very interesting language in terms of promoting his sort of role. And I was wondering if you could just comment on that in terms of a decolonial view, in terms of what he's been saying and how he approaches it. So race is a key component of what he's talking about. Colonialism is a key component of it, but it seems to be about face in terms of how where he goes with his conclusions.
Thanks, Gary. Should I take one from Janet as well, and then you can answer both, Tara, if that sounds good?
Yeah, that would be good.
Janet?
Yeah, thanks, Tara. I mean, I like your conclusion about the simple local action, etc., which is what many activists are trying to do. But I just think it's a little bit unhelpful to conflate extractivism and mining and industrial production and fossil fuel use and put them all into one sort of idea, like this is colonial production systems or something. So there's a gap, there's a little thing where you talk about the barrier being the narrative of climate action is incompatible with growth. But in fact, the narrative is not that. The dominant narrative now is precisely that the capitalist global economy can and must accommodate the transition, and this involves green industrialization. So there's a big thing in the middle, in between extractivism and climate action, which you are understanding in a certain way. So I wanted you to just unpack that a little bit.
Fantastic. Thank you, Janet, for that question. Tara, over to you.
So maybe I'll start with the second question first, because I think that they kind of link together. So I think when we start talking about coloniality, we're talking about a system of power and a way of pushing development onto people, right? It's not saying that there's just one form of development. I think green industrial development is equally complicit in these power dynamics. The examples of kind of colonial land grabs for the purpose of, or you might not call them colonial land grabs, let's just say land grabs that perpetuate very similar power dynamics between countries in the global north trying to fix their carbon emissions in the global south. So I'm with you that green industrialization is equally, a problem in this context. I think what I'm trying to demonstrate here is the utility of recognizing power dynamics that are behind different forms of development that get pushed onto people, and that we're still pushing for a certain kind of industrialization, and whether it's green or it's centering on extractive. I mean, green industrialization is still heavily extractive, right? You're still thinking about an extractive mode of development that is dependent on, maybe it's on lithium extraction for the sake of electricity, or it's the process of extractive development in the Northern Cape when we're thinking about green hydrogen. And I think sort of then to go back to the question about Mantashe and race and colonization, I think to me Mantashe is like the biggest supporter of colonial development. He is, and I think this is one of the issues that we need to be considering is that it's not enough for us to superficially engage with the history of colonization. We need to be thinking, but that's why I think coloniality is engaging with the way that we're thinking. Where are these thought patterns coming from? What is their origin? And I think Gwede Mantashe, regardless of his, you know, I mean, he is deeply entrenched and deeply subscribes to extractivism, and to me, this is, you cannot engage with I mean, this is the point that I was making, is that in South Africa, we have this association between wealth and extractive development, which in the context of the BEE program, which then creates this opposition between acting on climate change and acting on racial equality. But if you actually look at the history of the extractive industry, then you have this long history of, you know, racial inequality or inequality. And that's why I think it's important to combine the categories of both race and class, because you can't just be talking about race. You also need to be considering other power dynamics that are working in combination with race, that I don't think Gwede Mantashe is fully, engaging with. When he is pushing these narratives of extractive development at the cost of mining affected communities and communities affected.
Although he's a communist, so he has a class analysis.
Yeah, but I think that is quite a simplistic one, and he uses it, he punts it kind of as and when he, you know, like there's not a historic analysis of this in the sort of larger context. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by all the...
How do you know that? Do you know that? Do you know what Gwede Mantashe's understanding of history is?
Alrighty, thanks so much. I see we've got two hands on stack. I think Gwede Mantashe was one of the first communists to become a board of directors of a mining capitalist corporation. But we have Michaela and then Rebecca on stack. So Michaela, do you want to come in? So Michaela's going to ask via messaging, so maybe Rebecca can come in the meantime.
Sure. Thank you, Tara, for the presentation. It was very interesting, and thank you for the previous questions as well. It's been, I think it's like a, yeah, it speaks also to this debate and where coloniality and the kind of underpinnings theoretically of coloniality finds itself. I wanted to know kind of where you are seeing the labor movement, so not politicians, but the labor movement in this, in your work and in your studies. And I think noting that there's just been this trade unions for energy democracy that happened in Johannesburg this last week, I think, if I'm correct. And seeing, you know, how is your work and how is coloniality speaking to this like other way of understanding the dilemma of like the red versus green debates, and how do we place the labor movement so not a figure of or a former figure or whatever of that. And then I also wanted to know how you're seeing then coloniality in climate change action speak to questions of degrowth, and then degrowth also interacting with the labor movement and the organized labor movement. Yeah, if you have thoughts on that, thank you.
Thanks,
Should I respond to?
Yeah, go for it. There's two questions there. Also one in the chat from Michaela about if Gwede Mantashe is able to actually change policies to silence people who are affected by fossil fuel developments. Go for it.
Okay, I haven't read the one in the chat yet, but I'll first take Rebecca's and then take that one in the chat. So I think I think in this context, so with the red versus green, I think the conversation around a true just transition, I think, is a useful conceptualization. And I think we've seen the appropriation of the just transition concept by big businesses. But if you think about the history of the just transition as a concept, there was this unification of the interests of communities affected by environmental externalities and unions, labor unions, so working in, I think it was chemical plants. And so that's where the term the just transition came up, and then it's being applied to our energy transitions, right? But there's so much potential for a really radical union of these ideas that are centering the lived experiences of the working class, of those who are directly affected. And I think where I think decolonial theory comes into place, and I think gives us an opportunity for sort of a radical envisaging of what a just transition looks like, is that we can start opening up conversations to what does a good life look like, right? And what does a good life look like that isn't limited just to our existence in as producers or as a source of labor in a capitalist system. What does a good life look like in the way that we might build solidarity with each other in our day-to-day acts of care and acts of community, and sort of, I think there's a great potential for decoloniality and decolonial conceptions to come into that space. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers both of your questions. But yeah, I noted down coloniality speaking to climate, but I'm not sure if I captured that. Yeah. And then maybe I'll move on to the question in the chat. Or did I capture both questions?
Yeah, I think so. I think specifically around like the well, at least my two questions, but I'm not sure about Michaela's question. Maybe on the organized like labor and the perspective in that, and decolonial approaches to climate change could be helpful. But yeah, thank you.
And then Michaela's question is more specifically about Gwede Mantashe's powers and whether he has the ability to change policies to silence people affected by fossil fuel developments.
Yeah, I don't know about this. I mean, Alex you might actually know about this, but he was directly quoted recently, basically talking about changing the potential to change legislation. So I don't know if that's what your question is in connection with. I'm not sure about what his powers are necessarily, but in terms of his like soft power as a politician and a person who obviously receives quite a lot of support and has quite a lot of like gravity in his political position, I think he has a lot of soft power to sort of normalize the silencing of people who are against extractive developments. I don't know if that.
Thanks, Tara. Yeah, I think that answer, and maybe just to add there that, you know, there are also policy places that he can do that. So through things like the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, they've tried to weaken standards around free, prior, informed consent and weaken community consent. So they're also trying via various policy routes as well. Next up on our question stack, though, is Jaco Kruger. Jaco, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Alex, and thanks to Tara Just a question that links up, I think, with sort of towards the end of Rebecca's question as well. You highlighted the connection between coloniality and capitalist modernity, which of course I think is straight to the point there. And for me, the governing myth of this colonialist, capitalist, modernist kind of complex is infinite growth. And having said, I think this is still quite dominant, but there is an alternative narrative brewing, perhaps is the right word, I think, in the global north, which is the narrative of degrowth and the possibility of degrowth. And that's what I think Rebecca also mentioned. But my question really is how can this then function in the global south? So in our context here, because sometimes you get the sense that degrowth is for the global north and those established economies there in the global north. Can we link degrowth to decolonisation? How can that work? That's just what I'm wondering. So can the discourse on degrowth get a specifically decolonising slant in South Africa and in our context?
Go for it, Tara.
Yeah, I actually am now just realizing that was maybe one element of Rebecca's question that I didn't maybe completely address. But I think in terms of both, in fact, degrowth borrows from decolonial thinking this concept of buen vivir, which is what is a good life. And I think decolonial conceptions are very rooted in the global south. So I think we come back to this idea of what is a good life and what are the different kind of ideas of a good life that are put forward by different development narratives. And I think this can then be linked to the very kind of tangible work of, for example, building food sovereignty and like being able to operate maybe outside of a capitalist system and still being able to grow your own food, for example. And so I think there's a conversation that we need to be having amongst ourselves in South Africa. Like I don't have the answers to all of these things, but I think that we need to be thinking and be open to more a diversity of conceptualizing what does a good life look like for us in a South African context, and is it always contingent on a reliance on the extractive mode of development that doesn't seem to be addressing our sort of historic issues of inequality, yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Tara. I see Gary's come on to stack, and if anybody else has any questions, we've got a short few minutes left. Gary?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Tara, just to pick up on your thing, your point about what is a good life, I was wondering what role does energy play in a good life, so that can we live without electricity or a diminished amount of electricity, or are there other forms of energy that we should be adopting in the sense of a good life, and what's appropriate for us? Just your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Yeah. So I think this is a very tricky question to answer, but I think my response to it would be that in a South African context, we don't have equal energy access, and we also have high levels of inequality around energy consumption. So I think there are questions that we need to be asking around both where our energy is coming from in terms of the like whether it's fossil fuel or renewable energy, but also we need to be thinking about principles of redistribution that also apply to our energy grid and access to energy. And I think that this also ties, like you said, back to the question of a good life, which is like, we need to be tangibly engaging with the fact that there are certain limits. There are certain limits to our planet in terms of what it can support. But we also are existing in a society where large proportions of our population don't have access to even minimal energy. So how do we bring about a conception that of a good life that is thinking about more equitable access to energy, but perhaps like for our highest consumers of energy, which are historically the very elite in our society, how can we be thinking about them lowering their consumption of energy in order to open up more energy access for a wider proportion of the population? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tara. Yeah, and I think that does speak to that question that you asked us all about what does our current mode of energy also sacrifice, and is there ways of doing energy or building societies around energy that are more just and equitable and that actually deliver on better lives for all? So I think that question is a really important one. We do have, because we started 5 minutes late, we've got about 4 minutes. If anybody has a burning question, please feel free to jump in. But otherwise, I might ask Tara one question myself about whether you've seen successful examples of climate justice or environmental justice movements that have centered this sort of more decolonial narrative and kind of successfully driven forward that message, or if you think you could point to ways that could be done, if you don't know of any examples off the top of your head.
I mean, I think there are pockets, but I really think that there is a need for more engagement with this, and I also feel like, I mean, this was brought up previously, right? That conversations around colonization and decoloniality, they exist within within South Africa, but they're not as explicitly or sort of tangibly being linked to the climate crisis. And I think there's a big opportunity there. I think the Climate Justice Charter movement, they talk about making a very clear connection with decolonial ways of being. In terms of sort of tangible examples of that, I personally, I'm not sure what that looks like within the Climate Justice Charter movement. But I think we're coming back to kind of food sovereignty, building resilience at a local level that is centered around, food. I think that maybe is the biggest example in a South African context. But I think this is, I mean, part of the reason that I did my research on this is that I think we need, within the climate space, we need to be engaging with this. We need to be creating a space for this, these conversations and these links, because otherwise we really, we risk that conversations around decolonization equally then get put on an opposing climate action. And really what I wanted to show with this is that if you start engaging more deeply with concepts of decolonization, there is no contradiction between acting on the climate crisis and pursuing a sort of decolonial conversations and ways of engaging with the world. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Tara. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And maybe to also put in a plug for some of those that have been fighting against Shell, a lot of their framing has been precisely that this is part of a generations-long struggle against colonial corporations and so on. So there are elements of it, but I think part of the task of the broader movement is how do we take that and make it central to what we do and really lean into this more. And I think your work really nicely pushes people to start thinking more and more about this and incorporating that into how we understand the climate justice and the broader interconnected struggles that we face. So thank you so much for coming and sharing this great work with us. And thank you to everybody who came and had this discussion and these great questions and comments. And I think we're at the top of the hour. So Andrea, can I hand it over to you if you need to wrap anything up or do any announcements?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Alex, and thanks so much, Tara. Again, massive amount of frustrating conversation that we need to so I'm hoping we will keep continuing this conversation and that something will come out of it. Thank you very much though for raising a whole lot of very difficult kind of questions and issues. Thanks everybody. And just to announce quick that we will be having the final seminar for this semester next week, and then we'll have a bit of a break, and then we'll come back for a whole second semester of engagements after that. And the final seminar will be by Janet Cherry, and she will be talking hopefully about an example of something positive, a community-based ownership and production of energy. Hope I get that right, but yes, so yeah, keep fighting. And thank you all for listening, and yeah, hopefully see you next week. Okay.